The boarding area buzzed with the usual chaos of late-night travel, voices, layered over each other, tired footsteps dragging across the terminal floor, flight attendants, politely but firmly announcing boarding zones through static-filled speakers. For most, it was just another night of moving bodies from one city to the next. But for Derek Matthews, it was supposed to be a moment of quiet reflection before an important week ahead. Derek wasn't just another passenger. He was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing black-owned tech firms in America, a man who had built his empire from nothing but determination and long nights, coding in a cramped apartment. To the outside world, he was a polished executive, a billionaire in the making. But to himself, he was still the boy from Atlanta who had once stood in grocery lines, watching his mother count coins to pay for bread. When he boarded the plane that evening, dressed in a sharp navy suit and carrying nothing but a leather briefcase, he wasn't seeking attention. He only wanted to sit quietly in his first-class seat, catch up on reports, and prepare for the meetings waiting for him on the other side of the country. Seat 1A, an aisle seat in the front row, booked weeks in advance, was his sanctuary for the 5-hour journey. But as Derek approached his row, he froze. A woman with platinum blonde hair, wearing a tailored blazer and expensive jewelry, was already seated there. She adjusted her silk scarf with the kind of entitlement that spoke louder than words. Derek checked his boarding pass again. 1A. There was no mistake. "Excuse me," Derek said in a calm, measured tone. "I believe you're in my seat." The woman didn't even look up at first. When she finally raised her eyes, they carried a spark of irritation, as if his presence was an inconvenience. "This is my seat," she replied coldly, her voice carrying the weight of privilege sharpened by years, of never being questioned. Derek smiled politely and held out his ticket. 1A, that's mine." The woman's lips curled into a smirk. She leaned back and crossed her arms, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I think you're mistaken. Maybe you belong further back." The words stung not because Derek hadn't heard them before, but because they were familiar, echoes of a world that had always tried to tell him where he did or did not belong. Conversations from his youth, side comments in boardrooms, dismissals when investors once doubted him simply because of the color of his skin. It wasn't just a seat. It was a symbol. And now, in front of strangers, she had decided he didn't deserve it. A flight attendant approached, sensing tension. Derek explained the situation politely, presenting his boarding pass once again. The attendant checked the manifest and confirmed softly, "Yes, sir, Mr. Matthews is correct. This is his seat." But the woman's resistance hardened. "I've flown this airline for years. I always sit in this seat. You must have made some kind of error." She glanced at Derek, then back at the attendant, lowering her voice but not enough to hide the venom. "You're really going to move me for him?" Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. The weight of the him hung in the air like smoke. Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence alone carried power, but the attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. In that moment, Derek realized the deeper injustice. This wasn't about convenience or airline error. This was about dignity. His dignity. He leaned forward slightly, his words sharp but controlled. "I didn't build a company from the ground up just to be told, I don't belong in a seat I paid for. Either she moves or this plane doesn't take off tonight." The attendant blinked, startled. The woman scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "You don't have that kind of authority." But Derek did. With a calm, deliberate motion, he pulled out his phone. Within seconds, he was speaking to the chairman of the airline, a man he had once negotiated a multi-million-dollar partnership with. Derek's voice remained even, but it carried steel. "I'm sitting on one of your planes, and I've just been told I don't belong in the seat I purchased. I want you to know this flight isn't going anywhere until this is resolved." The surrounding passengers watched in stunned silence. The woman's confidence faltered for the first time, her face paling as she realized this wasn't just any man challenging her. The flight attendant, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation, apologized profusely and asked the woman to move, but she clung stubbornly to the armrest. "This is ridiculous. I'm not moving for him." Derek didn't flinch. He ended the call with the chairman and looked directly at the captain, who had now joined the scene. His voice was calm but unyielding. "Ground the plane now." The captain hesitated, torn between procedure and authority. But within minutes, the message was clear. The flight wasn't going anywhere until order was restored. What had begun as a simple act of arrogance by one passenger had now escalated into a standoff that threatened to disrupt hundreds of lives. Yet for Derek, this was not about delay. It was about principle. Too many times he had seen moments like these brushed aside, written off as misunderstandings, swept under the rug of, let's just move on. But not tonight. Tonight, the world would watch as dignity demanded its due. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some whispered in support of Derek, recognizing the injustice. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unwilling to acknowledge its truth. The woman, now visibly shaken, shifted uneasily in the seat she had claimed as her own. Derek stood tall, his presence filling the cabin with a quiet authority that no one could deny. He wasn't just fighting for himself in that moment. He was fighting for every time someone had been told they didn't belong, for every voice silenced, for every door closed. The seconds ticked by, heavy with tension. And in those minutes before the engines roared to life, the plane sat frozen on the tarmac, not because of mechanical failure, not because of weather, but because one black man refused to surrender his place. This was bigger than a seat. It was a stand. And as Derek's eyes locked on the woman who had tried to erase his dignity, the weight of centuries of struggle seemed to hang in the air. The passengers around him could feel it, the undeniable truth that history was being written in the narrow confines of row 1. The silence on the plane was suffocating. The engines hummed faintly in the background, but no one moved. No one dared to speak above a whisper. The captain's announcement had confirmed what Derek demanded. The flight was grounded until the issue was resolved. People shifted in their seats, glancing at their watches, their faces etched with frustration. But underneath the inconvenience was something deeper, an unspoken recognition that what they were witnessing was not a trivial squabble. It was a confrontation with truth itself. The woman in 1A gripped the armrest tighter, her knuckles whitening, as if holding on to that seat meant holding on to her place in a world that had always bent in her favor. But now, under the gaze of the passengers and the unwavering presence of Derek Matthews, her armor began to crack. The entitlement that had shielded her all her life offered no defense against the cold reality settling in around her. The flight attendant returned with the head purser, who approached Derek with a nervous smile. "Mr. Matthews, we sincerely apologize. We'll resolve this immediately. Please allow us to escort her out." But Derek shook his head slowly. His voice was measured, calm, but it carried the gravity of centuries. "It's not enough to remove her quietly. Everyone here needs to understand why this matters. Too often the offense happens in public, but the correction happens in private. Not tonight." Passengers stirred, leaning in. His words weren't spoken just for the airline staff or the woman before him. They were spoken for every person on that plane. For every person watching, listening, thinking they knew what dignity looked like until this moment forced them to question it. The purser hesitated, but Derek continued, his voice resonant. "I paid for this seat. I earned my place." And she tried to strip it away with one look, one word, one assumption, that I didn't belong. And too many times, people like me have swallowed that insult just to keep moving forward. But not anymore. Not while I'm here. A hush swept across the cabin. The woman's face flushed red, her confidence evaporating under the weight of truth. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Her excuses had no power here. Her authority had been stripped away by the simple, undeniable fact that she was wrong. Finally, the captain himself stepped forward. His voice was stern but respectful. "Ma'am, you need to vacate this seat immediately. Failure to comply will result in removal from the aircraft." The passenger's eyes followed her every move as she reluctantly stood, clutching her designer handbag like a lifeline. For the first time, she seemed small, diminished, a shadow of the woman who had once declared, "Maybe you belong further back." Derek didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His dignity was victory enough. He stepped aside as she was escorted down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor like the final notes of a performance gone wrong. A few passengers clapped softly, the sound hesitant but real. Others simply nodded, their expressions saying what words could not. Respect. Derek lowered himself into seat 1A at last. The leather was cool against his skin, but it felt more than comfortable. It felt like justice. Not just for him, but for the message that seat now carried. The purser leaned down and whispered, "We'll be offering you our deepest apologies on behalf of the airline, sir. This shouldn't have happened." Derek turned his gaze to the front, his tone even but heavy with truth. "No, it should never happen. Not to me, not to anyone. Make sure this isn't just another quiet apology. Make it change. The plane doors closed again. The engines roared to life, and as the aircraft finally began to move, a sense of collective reflection lingered in the air. The passengers had seen more than a seat dispute. They had witnessed a man stand tall against the erosion of dignity, against a lifetime of assumptions, against the easy silence that so often buries injustice. Hours later, when the plane touched down, Derek was the first to rise. As he gathered his briefcase, a middle-aged black father traveling with his teenage son approached him quietly. His voice trembled with emotion. "Thank you. My boy saw what you did tonight. He saw you refuse to bow. That matters more than you know." Derek smiled, a rare softness breaking through his stern exterior. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Never let anyone tell you where you don't belong. You decide that, always." The boy nodded, eyes wide, as if absorbing a lesson he would carry for a lifetime. As Derek exited the plane, cameras flashed. News had already traveled fast, passengers live-tweeting the incident, social media erupting with hashtags and debates. By the time he stepped into the terminal, reporters were already waiting, microphones thrust forward, eager for his statement. But Derek didn't give them a spectacle. He spoke the same way he had on the plane, calm, measured, resolute. "This isn't about a seat. It's about dignity. Tonight, I took a stand because too often, we let moments like this pass unchecked. We minimize them. We excuse them. And that silence becomes permission. I won't be silent anymore, and I hope none of you will be either." The crowd fell quiet, not because his words were loud, but because they were true. Over the following days, the story dominated headlines. Commentators debated it on morning shows. Articles dissected every angle: race, privilege, power, accountability. The airline issued a formal apology, announcing new diversity and sensitivity training. But for Derek, the true victory wasn't in corporate statements or media cycles. It was in the quiet messages flooding his inbox from strangers, black men and women who had faced similar slights, who felt invisible, who saw in him a mirror of their own struggles. One message stood out. A young woman wrote, "I watched the video of you standing your ground. I'm a law student, and last week a professor told me maybe I should aim lower. After seeing you, I know I don't have to aim lower. I can sit where I belong." Derek read it twice, his chest tightening with emotion. That was the point. That was why he couldn't stay silent. It was never just about one seat. It was about every seat, every place, every door that had been closed, every time someone had been told, "You don't belong." Weeks later, when Derek returned to the skies, the airline staff treated him with reverence, but he didn't seek it. He walked onto the plane with the same leather briefcase, the same quiet composure. But something was different now. Passengers glanced at him with recognition, not just of his face, but of what he represented. He took his seat, this time with no dispute, no hesitation. The hum of the engines surrounded him, but he felt a deeper silence inside, a silence that comes not from resignation, but from peace. He had drawn a line in the sand, and the world had heard it. And as the plane lifted into the night sky, Derek gazed out the window at the lights below, a quiet promise forming in his heart. He would keep fighting, not with fists or fury, but with presence, dignity and truth, because sometimes the most powerful stand you can take is refusing to move from the seat you have rightfully earned. The storm that began inside that aircraft did not end when Derek stepped off the plane. In fact, it was only the beginning. By morning, news outlets across the country carried the headline, "Black CEO grounds airline over seat dispute with white." "Passenger," the phrase exploded across social media, sparking debates that stretched far beyond one flight. Some voices praised Derek's courage, calling him a symbol of dignity, proof that silence was no longer an option. Others, predictably, tried to minimize the incident, dismissing it as an overreaction, an inconvenience blown out of proportion. But no matter which side they took, one truth was undeniable. People were talking. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability were being forced into the open. Derek had not asked to become a headline. His goal that night had been simple: take the seat he purchased, prepare for meetings, and move forward. But life rarely asks if you're ready to carry the weight of change. It simply hands you the moment and waits to see what you will do. At his office the following week, the energy was different. Employees greeted him with respect that felt deeper, heavier. A young black intern stopped him in the hallway, her eyes shining. "I watched the video 3 times, she said, her voice trembling. "The way you stood there. You didn't yell, you didn't lose control, but you didn't move. That gave me hope." Derek placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Hope is important," he said quietly. But action matters too. Take your place. Don't let anyone shrink you. That was the message he repeated again and again as invitations flooded in. Universities wanted him to speak. Civil rights groups asked for his voice. Corporate boards wanted his advice on how to address bias embedded in their systems. Derek didn't see himself as an activist. He was a builder, an entrepreneur. But he realized that leadership wasn't just about creating companies. It was about creating courage in others. The woman from Seat 1A eventually issued a public apology, though many doubted its sincerity. She spoke of misunderstanding, of stress, of confusion, but those who had been on that plane knew better. They had seen the look in her eyes, heard the way she had said, "Maybe you belong further back." That wasn't stress. That was supremacy, unmasked. And while her name faded from the headlines, Derek's didn't. Not because he sought the spotlight, but because he carried himself with the kind of dignity that cannot be erased once it's been seen. Months later, Derek returned to Atlanta for a community event. It was held in a gymnasium not far from the neighborhood where he had grown up, the cracked sidewalks, the corner stores, the sound of children playing in the streets. He stood before a crowd of young men and women, many wearing sneakers and hoodies, their eyes fixed on him like he was living proof of possibility. He told them the story, not the sanitized version, not the media soundbite, but the raw truth, the hesitation in the attendant's voice, the humiliation of being told he didn't belong, the decision to stand firm when every instinct told him to avoid conflict. He told them about the weight of silence, how it crushes generation after generation when left unchallenged. "You have a choice," Derek said, his voice filling the gym. "Every time the world tells you not here, not you, or not now, you have a choice. To move quietly and protect your peace, or to stand and protect your dignity." That night I chose dignity, and I need each of you to know you can too. Applause erupted, but beneath the sound was something greater, conviction, the kind that doesn't fade when the clapping stops. Derek walked off the stage, his mind heavy but his heart full. He knew his fight wasn't over. There would always be another seat, another room, another door where someone tried to measure his worth by the color of his skin. But he also knew this: every time he refused to yield, he wasn't standing alone. He was carrying with him the weight of history, the voices of ancestors who had been denied their place, the prayers of a mother who once counted coins for bread, the dreams of a generation yet unborn. The flight, the seat, the moment, it had become more than an incident. It had become a lesson. That dignity is not granted. It is claimed. And once claimed, it can never be taken back. And so, when Derek boarded another plane weeks later, the world watched differently. Not because they feared him, but because they recognized him. He wasn't just a CEO in Seat 1A. He was every person who had ever been told to move, who had ever been told to aim lower, who had ever been told they didn't belong. And he sat not just in a seat, but in his truth, unmoved, unshaken, unstoppable. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution doesn't come with fire or fury. Sometimes it comes with one man refusing to stand when he knows, without a doubt, that he has already earned the right to sit. Months after that unforgettable night, Derek found himself living in a world transformed by one choice, refusing to surrender his seat. What began as a moment of defiance inside a crowded cabin had spilled into boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the nation. His company had grown tenfold. Investors who once doubted him now clamored for meetings. But for Derek, the real measure of success wasn't in revenue or contracts. It was in the emails, letters, and conversations that poured in daily. A single mother in Detroit wrote to him, "My daughter saw what you did on that plane. She said if you can sit where you belong, she can too. Thank you for showing her she doesn't need permission to take her place." But with recognition came scrutiny. Critics painted him as divisive, accusing him of dramatizing an ordinary dispute. Talk show panels argued endlessly. Was he a hero? Or just a man with influence flexing his power? Derek listened but never engaged. He knew the truth. When dignity is on trial, silence is not an option. And though critics tried to shrink the story, they could not erase its power. The pressure also weighed on his company. Journalists camped outside headquarters. Employees were bombarded with questions. One board member even suggested, Derek let the story fade for the sake of business. Derek looked him in the eye and said quietly, "If my dignity is bad for business, then we're building the wrong kind of business." His words rippled through the company like fire. People worked harder, with a sense of pride that had little to do with profit. They knew they were part of something greater, a company not just creating technology, but rewriting what leadership looked like. Meanwhile, the airline itself underwent sweeping changes. New training programs, stricter accountability, partnerships with civil rights organizations. Derek had refused their offer of a private settlement. "Write me no check," he told their executives. Instead, change the culture that made this possible. For once, a corporation listened. Still, Derek carried the weight of the moment privately. Late at night, he would replay the scene in his mind. The way the woman's words had cut. The hesitation in the attendants' eyes. The quiet gasps of passengers. He thought of his mother, long gone, and wondered what she would say if she had seen her son that night. In his heart, he already knew. Boy, you sat for all of us. One evening, he attended a gala honoring leaders in social justice. The room was filled with activists, scholars, and visionaries. When Derek was called to the stage, he paused at the podium, scanning the crowd. He could have spoken of progress, of business success, of policy changes, but instead he told them a story. He described being a boy at a diner in Atlanta, sitting with his mother as a waitress ignored them for nearly 20 minutes. He described the shame that burned in his chest as his mother calmly packed their things and whispered, "We don't beg for service where we aren't seen." He described walking past polished boardroom, doors years later, hearing laughter inside, and wondering if those seats would ever open for someone like him. And then, one night on a plane, Derek said, his voice steady, I realized the seat I had always been waiting for was already mine. Paid for, earned. All I had to do was sit. The audience rose to their feet, applause echoing like thunder. But Derek didn't bask in it. He simply stepped back, his eyes glistening, knowing that applause was never the goal. The goal was awakening. In the weeks that followed, Derek began mentoring young leaders. Not just business students, but activists, artists, community organizers. His message remained simple. Your seat is yours. Don't wait for permission. Don't surrender it to anyone who tells you otherwise. Sit and let the world adjust around you. And slowly, a movement began to form, not around Derek as a man, but around his stand as a symbol. The hashtag #OurSitInYourSeat spread across campuses, offices, and churches. It became a mantra whispered before job interviews, graduations, even court hearings. Sit in your seat. Own your place. Refuse to move. Derek often smiled at the irony. He had never set out to start a movement. He had only wanted to prepare for a meeting, to get to his destination. But maybe that was the point. Change doesn't arrive when you're ready. It arrives when you least expect it, asking only if you will answer. One spring morning, Derek returned to his old neighborhood in Atlanta. He walked past the corner store where he used to buy candy, past the schoolyard where he once dreamed of building something bigger. Children ran up to him, tugging at his jacket, shouting his name. And as he looked around, he realized something profound. The real seat he had claimed wasn't on a plane. It was here, among his people, showing them what was possible. He sat on a worn bench outside the store, surrounded by laughter and questions. For the first time in months, he felt completely at peace. Not because the struggle was over, it never was, but because he had done his part. And as the sun dipped behind the skyline, painting the streets gold, Derek Matthews knew this truth with unshakable certainty. The world may try to move you, dismiss you, erase you, but dignity is not theirs to take. It is yours to keep. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is the courage to stay seated where you belong. Months had turned into a year, but the story of that single flight continued to echo far beyond the runway. Derek never intended to become a symbol. Yet symbols are rarely chosen. They are forged by moments of truth. What began as a struggle for one seat had grown into something larger, a mirror held up to society, forcing it to see itself, flaws and all. The airline, under relentless pressure, had implemented sweeping reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training became a requirement for every staff member. Policies were rewritten to ensure accountability and respect, not only for first-class passengers, but for every human being who stepped through their doors. Competitors soon followed, afraid of being the next headline. For once, change did not arrive wrapped in empty promises. It came because silence was no longer affordable. Derek watched these changes unfold with a quiet satisfaction, but also with caution. He knew policies could be written and still ignored. Real transformation, he believed, began not in boardrooms but in hearts. And so he chose to keep speaking, not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a man who carried the weight of truth. In one particularly moving speech at Howard University, he told the students, when they told me to move, They weren't just questioning my seat. They were questioning my right to belong in spaces I had worked for, paid for, earned with my blood and years. And when I said no, I wasn't just speaking for me. I was speaking for every black man and woman who had ever been told, "This is not your place, but here's the truth. Our place is wherever we decide to stand." The crowd had erupted, but Derek's words weren't meant for applause. They were meant to live in the marrow of those who heard them, to whisper strength when doubt crept in. Not everyone applauded, of course. There were critics who accused him of weaponizing race, of exploiting a minor incident for attention. Derek didn't respond to them because he didn't need to. He knew the truth. Silence protects the comfortable, not the oppressed. If telling the story made some uneasy, that discomfort was the first step toward awakening. Privately, though, Derek wrestled with the cost of carrying this story. Each retelling forced him back. Into that night, the sting of being told he didn't belong, the ache of humiliation, the rage he kept buried beneath composure. There were nights when he sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights flickering against glass walls, wondering why progress always demanded such wounds, why dignity for some had to be purchased through the pain of others. But then he would think of his mother. He would remember her bent over a sewing machine late at night, stitching clothes for neighbors to earn extra cash, whispering prayers over every seam. She had always told him, "One day, you will sit where they said you couldn't. And when you do, don't just sit for yourself. Sit for all of us." And so, whenever weariness tried to take him, he remembered her voice. And he sat. Years later, long after the headlines faded, Derek boarded another flight. This time he was traveling not for business, but to attend his daughter's graduation. She was becoming a lawyer, her ambition shaped by years of watching her father fight battles with dignity. As he settled into his seat, first class again, but this time without stares or whispers, he noticed the flight attendant pause. She looked at him, smiled warmly, and said, "Mr. Taylor, welcome aboard." "It's an honor." It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of history, respect freely given. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the hum of the engine surround him. The fight had been long, and it was not over, but in that moment, he allowed himself something rare, peace, because he knew that his choice, made years before in the narrow aisle of another plane, had helped carve a path for those who would come after him. Derek had not just grounded an airline, he had lifted a generation. And in the quiet of that cabin, somewhere between earth and sky, he finally allowed himself to breathe, deep, steady, unbroken, because he had proven once and for all that dignity cannot be stolen. It can only be surrendered. And he had never let it go. Years passed, and the story of Derek Taylor on that fateful flight became more than just an article buried in archives. It became a lesson repeated in classrooms, a case study dissected in leadership seminars, and a story whispered in homes where children asked their parents, "What did he do? Why does it matter?" By then, Derek had transitioned from the fast-paced grind of corporate boardrooms into a slower, more intentional life. He had built companies, advised presidents, and shaped policies, but the seat he refused to surrender remained the defining moment of his journey, not because it was the most profitable or the most glamorous, but because it was the most human. One summer evening, Derek sat on the porch of his home, rocking gently as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber and purple. His granddaughter Maya climbed onto his lap, her curls bouncing as she looked at him with wide, curious eyes. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "is it true you stopped a whole airplane?" Derek chuckled, a deep sound that carried both joy and memory. "That's what people say, baby girl. But the truth is I didn't stop an airplane. I stopped a lie." Maya tilted her head. "What lie?" "The lie that said I didn't belong," he answered, his voice steady. "The lie that said because of my skin I was worth less. The lie that has followed our people for centuries, trying to tell us where we can and cannot sit, live, dream, or rise. That night I said no to the lie. And when you say no to lies, sometimes the whole world has to pause." Her small fingers traced the lines of his weathered hand. "Did it hurt?" she asked, her innocence piercing deeper than she could know. "Yes," Derek said honestly. "It hurt to be told I was less. It hurt to be humiliated in front of strangers. But the pain reminded me that silence was no longer an option. Some hurts become fuel, and that night, I burned every doubt they tried to place on me." Maya nodded slowly, as if absorbing not just his words, but the weight behind them. For her, the story wasn't abstract. It was living proof, sitting before her, breathing, rocking, holding her with arms that had carried not only companies but the dignity of a people. And in that quiet moment, Derek realized something profound. His victory had outlived him. His act of defiance was no longer just his story, it had become part of their inheritance. Beyond his family, the story had grown into something larger. In schools across the country, teachers referenced the seat that changed flight. When discussing modern civil rights, in documentaries, his face appeared alongside legends who had refused to move, refused to yield, refused to let history repeat itself. Derek never sought such comparison, but he understood the thread that tied them together. Ordinary people in ordinary moments, making choices that shaped extraordinary futures. One evening, while attending a community banquet in Atlanta, Derek was introduced to a young entrepreneur who had just launched a tech startup. The man, barely 30, shook Derek's hand with a reverence that bordered on awe. "Sir," he said, "when I was in college, I almost dropped out. I didn't think I belonged in those classrooms. But then I read about what you did on that plane. I realized if you could claim your seat in that cabin, I could claim mine in any lecture hall. Today, my company employs 100 people. Because of you, I stayed." Derek didn't reply with speeches or grand advice. He simply squeezed the man's hand and said, "Then I didn't sit for nothing." That became his quiet mantra in later years. I didn't sit for nothing. Every time he saw a young black executive take the stage, every time he read about a student breaking barriers, every time he looked into the eyes of his children and grandchildren, he knew the answer. His seat had never been just about travel. It was about truth. In the final years of his life, Derek wrote a memoir. He titled it simply, The Seat. Not because he wanted to immortalize himself, but because he wanted future generations to understand that dignity doesn't arrive with titles, money, or recognition. It begins the moment you decide you belong, and it grows every time you refuse to surrender that belief. The book closed with a line that would be quoted for decades. "The world will tell you to move 1,000 times. Move for kindness, move for love, move for peace, but never move for lies, never move for hate, and never move for anyone who tells you that you are less." When Derek passed, the story of the flight was retold once more. But this time it wasn't told with anger or outrage. It was told with reverence. Because what began as an insult had become a beacon. What started as humiliation had blossomed into legacy. And somewhere in the echo of his journey, one truth remained unshaken. Derek Taylor had not just claimed his seat. He had claimed history. The years had stretched long, and Derek's name had become more than a headline. It had become a quiet hymn in the story of justice. His family carried his lessons like scripture. His community remembered him as a living testimony, and strangers across the world whispered his words whenever they faced a door that dared to shut in their faces. On the anniversary of his passing, the city of Atlanta unveiled a bronze statue in his honor. It wasn't monumental in size nor wrapped in grandeur. Instead, it was simple. A man seated calmly in a first-class chair, his posture upright, his gaze steady, his hands resting gently on his knees. No fist raised, no aggression, no crown upon his head. Just a man sitting, unmoved, unyielding. The inscription beneath read, "Dignity sits where it chooses." Derek Taylor, 1968, 2043. Crowds gathered for the unveiling. Students who had studied his memoir, activists who had drawn strength from his resolve, flight attendants who remembered that night, all stood shoulder to shoulder, many holding candles. His daughter spoke, her voice breaking and strong all at once. "My father never wanted to be remembered for anger. He wanted to be remembered for truth. That night on the plane, when they told him to move, he taught the world that silence is a choice, but so is dignity. And today we sit here because he sat there, and he never moved." Tears ran down faces both young and old. It wasn't just the statue that moved them. It was the reminder that dignity was not a gift granted by systems, but a birthright that could only be surrendered by the individual. Later that evening, as the sun fell and the city lights flickered awake, Derek's granddaughter Maya walked slowly around the statue. She was older now, a lawyer like her mother, her spirit forged by the stories her grandfather had left behind. She touched the cold bronze armrest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Grandpa, I'm still sitting." And in that whisper lived the promise that his story had not ended, it had only multiplied. Across the world, the echoes continued. In Johannesburg, a classroom of students analyzed the case as part of their curriculum on justice. In London, a poet recited verses inspired by Derek's memoir, weaving his story into the rhythm of spoken word. In Chicago, a group of young professionals launched a nonprofit named The Seat, dedicated to mentoring first-generation Black students entering corporate spaces. Derek had never set out to become eternal. He had simply refused to be erased. But eternity has a way of finding those who stand or sit at the right time, in the right place for the right reason. The world didn't remember the name of the woman who tried to take his seat. Her moment had faded into dust, her arrogance lost to time. But they remembered the man who refused to move. Because dignity has a longer memory than prejudice. Because in the end, every generation faces its own version of that aisle, that seat, that moment of choice. And every person must decide, will I move quietly into silence, or will I sit firmly in truth? Derek Taylor had made his choice, and because he did, the world would never be quite the same. And long after planes had taken off, long after headlines had faded, long after even the bronze statue had weathered with age, his story remained, not just written in books or carved in stone, but carried in the hearts of those who knew the power of one man, one seat, one refusal, unmoved, unbroken, unforgotten. There comes a time when every story must close, not because its meaning has ended, but because it has taken root in those who hear it. Derek Taylor's journey began on an ordinary night, with an ordinary flight, and a single request that seemed small to some, but carried the weight of centuries. They asked him to move. He chose to stay, and that choice became history. From that moment, he taught us something eternal, that the fight for dignity is rarely loud, rarely glamorous, rarely planned. It is often quiet. It is often lonely. It is often disguised as something as simple as a seat on a plane. But within that simplicity lives a battlefield as vast as justice itself. Derek's strength was not in force, but in stillness. He did not raise his voice, yet his silence roared louder than any argument. He did not strike, yet his presence struck down the arrogance of privilege. He did not move, yet he moved the world. That is the paradox of true courage. It does not need to shout to be heard across generations. And so, his story became more than a man's memory. It became a mirror. A reminder that each of us in our own lives will face moments when we are told, this is not your place. Not here, not now, not you. And when that moment comes, we will hear his voice echoing across time. Do not move. The world will always try to redraw the boundaries of where you belong. It will try to convince you that your seat, your stage, your place at the table was meant for someone else. But belonging is not something given. It is not a gift wrapped in permission. It is not a seat assigned by those who doubt you. Belonging is lived, claimed, sat in, fully and unapologetically. Derek Taylor is gone, but his seat remains. It remains in every classroom where a Black child raises their hand without fear. It remains in every courtroom where a Black lawyer speaks truth to power. It remains in every boardroom where a Black leader claims authority without apology. And it remains in every heart that has ever been told to shrink, but chooses instead to rise. The woman who tried to take his place is forgotten. The airline that once faltered has long since moved on. But Derek's story has not faded, because truth has longer legs than lies. Lies stumble, lies collapse, but truth endures. And now, as the final chapter closes, one lesson lingers like the hum of an aircraft long after it has flown overhead. Dignity cannot be stolen. It can only be surrendered. And those who refuse to surrender, it will live forever in the memory of all who come after. So when you hear this story, do not just admire it. Do not just repeat it. Live it. Carry it into your meetings, into your classrooms, into your travels, into your life. Let it remind you that the most powerful revolutions often begin not with fire and fury, but with one person in one moment, choosing to remain unmoved. And if ever the world tries to take your place, remember Derek Taylor. Remember his stillness. Remember his courage. Remember his seat, because he sat for all of us. And he never moved. Unmoved, unbroken, unforgotten. The story ends here. But the lesson? The lesson has only just begun.